We're writing research papers. We talked about maybe we need to write a paper to get promoted, to get a grant, to get a fellowship, to present at an international meeting, to make the boss happy, maybe if we're lucky win the Nobel Prize. But I think the last two are the most important. We put our patients and study participants through tremendous risks and challenges. We design clinical protocols which are inconvenient, costly, often painful. And if we don't take the responsibility to use their volunteerism and their altruism to contribute to our studies, if we don't publish, good, bad, or indifferent, we're doing a disservice to their participation in our studies. And I have an ethical problem when I see data collected from human beings that's not being published properly. But most importantly, I think we all are here because we want to make a difference. And if we're going to publish papers that change clinical practice or change public health practice or change the way we think about science, those are all publishable papers. And that's what I hope everyone in this room will be able to do. The research question is specific, clear, and important, is to ask yourself, do other people understand and like your research question? So it's a good idea, if you have a research question, to ask your friends and colleagues to help you define that research question. See if they like it. See if they understand it. So let's now think about what's an important research question. What's an important a prevalent research question that's important to us? So this is sort of my definition of an important research question. An important research question, in my view, is a question which, if answered, will either change clinical practice, change public health practice, or change scientific understanding. If your research paper doesn't significantly change either clinical practice, how doctors and nurses care for their patients, it doesn't change public health practice, how the government and NGOs and programs manage a problem, or it doesn't change basic scientific knowledge, it's really not, in my view, a novel and important question. Why is this important for publications? We want everyone involved in this to get a paper published by the end of June in an international peer-reviewed journal. And so these are the kinds of issues that reviewers ask themselves when they read a paper. One of the most important things they ask themselves is this paper going to change clinical practice, change public health practice, or change our scientific understanding? If they can say yes to any of these, you have a much higher chance of your paper being published. So think about those criteria when you're discussing your rationale for your scientific question. It also has to be beyond Uganda, because if you're addressing questions around clinical practice, public health practice, or scientific understanding, and it's been done everywhere in the world except Uganda, the international reviewers are going to refer to that as a Me Too study. So a Me Too study is a study that simply restates what others have already said. It's already reported elsewhere, but someone would say, we've already reported these data elsewhere and these conclusions, but this is the first study in Uganda. That's a Me Too study. A study that's done anywhere, including Uganda, that's simply confirming or restating conclusions from a prior study. And I add this one, a really interesting research question, but it's not important. It doesn't change clinical practice, it doesn't change public health practice, and it doesn't change scientific knowledge. And so if you're really intent on getting a paper published in an international journal, you have to step away from the perspective that a study that's never been done in Uganda is sufficient rationale for getting a paper published. Now, it doesn't mean you shouldn't repeat studies in Uganda that have been done elsewhere. And I used to have the same conversation with my friends in India. So there may be a lot of studies done in other countries that have identified key principles of public health or clinical research. So your research question, as you think about it, you want to be thinking about the following issues again. Is your research question specific, clear, and important? And if it's important, it should change clinical practice, it should change public health practice, and it should change scientific understanding. And the best way to assess that is to ask others whether they understand and like your research question. This next session is going to be much more practical. What we thought we would do is focus on very specific and practical things that I would recommend you do if you're going to write a successful paper. Everybody's got their own styles about how to do this, but this is based on my own experience. I'm helping lots of people write papers, including myself. And try to give me the benefit of the doubt and try out this method and see how well it works to get you that draft that we're all looking for. So before I write a paper, I need to have a paper outline. So what is an outline? What's a paper outline? What would you describe it to be? So what's rule number one before you start your outline? What's rule number one before you start writing your outline for a paper? What's rule number one before you start writing the outline for your paper? Define the research question first. Do not draft an outline for a paper that does not have a research question. It's a waste of your time. Always, always, always start with the research question before you outline the paper. What's rule number two of what you should do before you outline your paper? Define the research question first is rule number two. And rule number three, define the research question first. Do not write an outline or a paper until you have defined your research question first. So how do you outline a paper? What's step one? Define the research question first. I'm saying this over and over and over again. I cannot tell you how many times I see people make that mistake. They start writing a paper, outlining a paper, before they know exactly what the research question is. So the next thing I like to do is I draft the outline or the script. I call it a script. For me, it's almost like thinking about a recipe for baking a cake in very sequential order. But I do it for the entire paper. Start at the top. You've got a title page with authors, with a title. You've often got an acknowledgement. You've got an abstract, an introduction. You've got methods, results. You've got a discussion. You've got references. You may have I or B sections you have to put in. So every paper has a very specific structure to it. That's just the beginning of the outline. So you begin by making an outline of the entire paper. Okay? Don't just outline the introduction. Don't just outline the method section. Once you define your research question, outline the entire paper. So then you take that outline and you use that outline to tell the story of the paper to other people. Because a good paper will be retold the same way time and time and time again. If you can go through your outline and explain your paper, you can say, here's what I'm going to say in the introduction, here's what I'm going to say in the method section, in the order it's going to flow, here's what I'm going to say in the results section, here's what I'm going to say in the discussion section, bullet points, bullet points, bullet points, here are the references I need. If you can tell that story with your outline over and over and over again, the same way, and if you can give it to someone else and they can tell that story back to you consistently, you have an outstanding outline. Once you have an outstanding outline, it's very easy to write the paper. The problem is getting to that outline. And we're going to practice some of that in a moment. Tell the same story again, again, and again. Give the outline to a co-author. In fact, give all your final outlines to your co-authors before you start writing the paper. Make sure they agree with the story that you're trying to tell. Don't write the paper until your co-authors agree with the same story. Once you finish your outline, before you write your paper, talk to your co-authors and think about what journals, who's your audience for this story. Help you think about which kind of journals you want to send it to. Is it a public health journal, a TB journal, a policy journal? What is the story you're trying to tell with this outline? That will help you decide who your audience is. And then once you've done that, then you want to finalize the outline for the entire paper. Don't skip any sections. Don't just write the intro and the background. Don't just write or draft an outline for the results section. The whole paper has to flow together through one consistent outline. It makes it much easier to write and much easier to read. So, what is a complete first draft? We're going to make a definition here of what a complete first draft is. What is a complete first draft? In my definition, sometimes what we work on ourselves is, I call it an initial first draft. This is where you have your outline and you write your first draft. Is that the one you share with all your co-authors? Not me, because it's not complete. I don't want to bother my co-authors with a paper that's not complete for review. It's a waste of their time. It's a waste of my time. I want a complete draft to share with my authors. The manuscript you share with your co-authors, I call my complete draft. It has everything in it. Title page, acknowledgement, abstract, everything, including the references. That's a complete manuscript. That's a complete first draft. That's the draft I send to my co-authors. Now, in the interim, as I said earlier, I think it's okay for you to share your outline. And in fact, probably important for you to share your outline with your co-authors before you write the paper. Make sure they agree with your outline. But once you start to write that paper, finish the complete paper, the first draft, before you share it with your co-authors. Please don't share the initial draft that's not complete with your co-authors. It's, in my experience, difficult, waste of time. Don't just send the introduction section. See to your co-authors, say, please read the introduction. Or go take a look at these discussion section. Please read the discussion. Have the entire paper finished with a draft that includes all of the components. It's a lot more efficient for you and a lot more efficient for your co-authors to get that paper finalized and into submission. I can't review an introduction of a paper unless I know what the study question is, unless I know what's in the methods, the results, and the discussion. I can't, as a reviewer, understand what the paper's script is if I don't see all the sections. I don't understand the point, so I can't edit very well. So send a complete draft to your authors. So when do you write the first draft? You should know my opinion by now. You write the first draft, you actually write the first draft when you and the co-authors can use your outline to tell the same story over and over and over again, consistently. That's when the outline is complete. And my advice is, as soon as you get everybody on board with that outline, you know that outline frontwards and backwards, your co-authors like it, the best time to write is immediately. because it's fresh in your mind. If you wait a week, 2 weeks, a month, 6 months, you'll forget it. The best time is to write it immediately. And you're going to need many hours of uninterrupted time to write the first draft, because you're not going to do it properly. You're not going to write the introduction today and the methods tomorrow, and we're going to write the results next week and the discussion the following week. You have to sit down, close the door, draft the entire story following your outline from the beginning to the end. Now you can come back and edit it. We'll talk about that. But get the whole story down, follow the script. So some practical tips on the first draft. So again, this is to reinforce the point. Never draft an outline without a specific, clear, and important research question. Never draft a paper without a final outline. Make sure all your co-authors like and agree with your research question and final outline. The final outline is what tells the story of your paper. And then, when everybody's happy, read the submission and formatting requirements for whatever journal you're targeting, because they often will have different requirements for fonts and formatting and how many tables and so forth. It's very important before you start to write to know what the font sizes need to be, to know what the sections of the paper need to be for that journal. Here's some other practical tips. After you've got your outline, you've got your study question, now you've completed your outline, you're ready to go. I typically create tables and figures first. Now, in my outlines, I have a space for the table 1, table 2, table 3. I know in my outline what the tables are. My outline includes the tables and figures. My outline includes all the key points I want to make in a bullet list. At the introduction, the methods, results, conclusion. I have bullets for all the key points in a very specific order that I want to make. So I know what tables I want table 1 to be, figure 1, table 2, etc. That's in my outline. But when I'm ready to write, I create the tables first. And then just to re-emphasize the point, I like to write the entire initial draft with the exception of the abstract. I'll say more about that, and the references. So when I'm writing my initial draft, I don't worry about the abstract or the references in that first draft. I write all the way through, including title page, but I hold off on the abstract and references. Now sometimes when I'm writing, I'll put a little R in the text to remind myself that that's where I want to reference. And then I'll come back to put the references in. But I don't worry about I want to get the story down. I want to get the script to be reflected in the story I've just written. And I have to do this in one setting. If I have to write a paper and I start writing the introduction and I get distracted and have to go see students, and 2 hours later I come back, it takes me 30 minutes to figure out where I was on my outline. So I've wasted 30 minutes. And then if I get pulled aside to go home and take care of something else, and by the time I come back I forget where I was even in the beginning, I have to start all over again. It's a complete waste of time. I need to be locked in a room, uninterrupted, no children calling, no student interruptions, no clinical time, and I need to get it done. Otherwise, it's a very inefficient process for me. And I don't have a whole lot of extra time to be inefficient. Now, we're going to talk about some of this in a minute. In a scientific paper, use very, very clear and concise sentences. Writing a research paper is essentially telling a story. We talked about the word script. We talked about storyline. It is telling a story, but it's not a fable. It's not a metaphorical story. It's not people in Africa are very good at telling stories. So I'm sure you're going to be very good at telling scientific stories, but it's a little different language. It's crisp language, short sentences. It's not metaphorical. It's not allegorical. It's very precise language, and it's not easy. If you're used to speaking a certain way or describing situations a certain way, using metaphor and allegory and adjectives and adverbs, we tend to write that way. That's certainly the way I wrote when I started out. But writing a research paper is very different. Very precise, very, very concise sentences. When you're writing your draft, stick to the script. You worked hard on that script. You got everybody to agree. Don't go off the script. Follow the script. And then I usually add the references at the end. I make a note in the text as I'm writing where I want to reference, but I go back later to find out where those references are. Finally, on this section, always, always, always edit grammar, spelling, punctuation, formatting, tables, figures, and references before you share the complete draft. When my students send me a draft at Hopkins and the formatting of the tables are not correct, or they didn't check the spelling, or they didn't have the punctuation right, I just give it back to them. They should have learned that, when they were in grade school. They should give me a paper that I can really spend my time not editing the words and the language and the formatting, but editing the science and the script. So please don't do that for your co-authors either. They have spell checks, they have grammar checks, and sometimes, earlier in my career, I would write a draft and give it to someone who had no idea what I was writing about, who was actually a good reader. Sometimes my wife would put her to sleep. But she was a good editor, and she would pick up my grammar errors and my punctuation errors. Okay, let's say a bit about titles. The title of a paper, I like good titles. One of my favorite journals are the British journals, because they have such great titles. When you read a good title in Lancet or BMJ, they tell you something about the paper. It's not just a simple descriptive title. It tells you what the paper is about. It gets your attention. You want to get a paper published, write a title that's going to get your attention. Write a title that makes a point and sells the manuscript. Don't just make it a boring title. Don't forget, someone mentioned this, before you send your complete manuscript around, don't forget to add the authors to the title page. I'll say something about authorship later. Don't forget to add the human subject section. If you have research funded by a grant, include the grant numbers. Write the abstract last. Why do you write the abstract last? I have two reasons why I tell my colleagues write the abstract last. So when's the easiest time to write an abstract? Yeah, the hardest time to write an abstract is before you wrote the paper. The other reason I insist on this for my students is that I don't want them to present something at an international meeting unless they have the paper done first. So I encourage them, write the paper and then the abstract, then submit the abstract. Then you'll have something to say if your abstract's accepted to the international meeting. Get the paper done first, because it's a lot easier and you'll write a much better abstract and you'll have a much better chance of getting that paper accepted. Okay, so again, a complete first draft has a title page, authors, abstract, introductions, methods, figures, tables, discussions, references, and acknowledgement. It has all the pieces. So let's talk about editing the first draft. Again, these are just very practical tips. My advice is that you double space the title page and the entire text. It makes it easier for editing. Most journals require that. Use spell check. Mention that. Use grammar check. Double check the figure and table formatting before you send it to your co-authors. Check the text formatting and double check the references before you share it with the... I've had many papers where I go through, I get annoyed when I see a reference that I know and I look and it's in the wrong place in the manuscript, or it's the wrong reference because nobody bothered to double check before they sent it. Give the draft to an objective friend like your husband or your wife, perhaps, or another colleague, to have them take a look at it. And if you need to, listen, we're not all born knowing how to write well. And a lot of us will actually give it papers and grants to professional editors to help improve the language, and that's a good idea if you can do it. So a good table or figure communicates everything needed to understand it. A reader or a reviewer should not need to read the text of your paper to completely understand a figure or table. So you should include a clear title that says something on every figure and table. Format it to make it easy to read. Use footnotes for tables, legends, figure legends for figures to help explain it. Again, this good table figure can stand alone and be understood completely without the text. If you hand that table or figure to someone and they don't understand it, it's not quite ready. What does it mean to use clear and concise language? So just a couple more examples. One of the things I ask people to do in the applications is to complete, I said, to answer this question, state what you expect will be the key conclusions of your paper in no more than 50 words. So these would be your top conclusions from your paper. Thank you. So let's talk about authorship. So this is the website for the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, that almost all PubMed journals abide by this regulation and definition of authorship. Does anybody ever seen this before? So what does this say? The uniform requirement for manuscripts submitted to biomedical journals defines the following. An author must satisfy all three of these conditions. An author must contribute substantially to the conception and design of the study, the acquisition of data, or the analysis and interpretation. Must do that. Must provide critical revision or drafts of the article. And number 3, must document their final approval of the article submitted. All 3 of those requirements are an absolute requirement for authorship in international journals. And in fact, when you sign an authorship page on most journals, you have to sign and document your role in each of these three things to be considered officially an author. The guidelines specifically say that being listed as a PI or co-investigator that acquired funding or is just generally supervising the research alone does not constitute authorship. It's in the international guidelines. So just because I'm a PI or a co-investigator listed on a grant, unless I contribute to those 3 things, I'm not an author. In fact, there are lots of papers that were written under my grants at Hopkins where I was a PI where I'm not on the paper because I didn't feel I had contributed to all 3 of those criteria. All authors must be able to understand and support the paper's major results and conclusions. So if asked, if I'm not a true author, I won't be able to answer those questions. All authors must make a reasonable attempt to verify and confirm the accuracy of the data and analysis included on the paper. There are many examples, sad examples, where false data was published. And very famous people her reputations were shattered because they would put their names on papers without verifying the validity of the data. And all authors must disclose any potential conflict of interest. So, I just thought I'd throw that out as a final thought. Those are the official recommendations. Obviously, life is complicated and challenging. And negotiations around authorship are challenging. In my own experience, I think it's important to have those conversations transparently and upfront and right in the beginning with all co-authors. So that when that first complete paper is drafted, no one will be surprised about, because that first complete draft is going to have the authors on it, and no one who reads that should be surprised. So let me finish by just reminding us about why we're writing research papers. We talked about maybe we need to write a paper to get promoted, to get a grant, to get a fellowship, to present at an international meeting, to make the boss happy, maybe if we're lucky win the Nobel Prize. But I think the last 2 are the most important. We put our patients and study participants through tremendous risks and challenges. We design clinical protocols which are inconvenient, costly, often painful. And if we don't take the responsibility to use their volunteerism and their altruism to contribute to our studies, if we don't publish, good, bad, or indifferent, we're doing a disservice to their participation in our studies. And I have an ethical problem when I see data collected from human beings that's not being published properly. But most importantly, I think we all are here because we want to make a difference. And if we're going to publish papers that change clinical practice or change public health practice or change the way we think about science, those are all publishable papers. And that's what I hope everyone in this room will be able to do. So thank you very much.